So good evening, everyone. I am Nora Hickings-Achille, Director of the Centre Culturel Irlandais in Paris, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this online conversation with Maggie O'Farrell, hosted by the Centre Culturel Irlandais and Éditions Belfond. This conversation marks the launch of the French translation of Maggie's tremendous novel Hamnet, her 8th novel and 8th to be published by Belfond. The relationship with Belfond goes back to 2000, which is really quite something. And in addition to the 8 novels, Belfond has also published the memoir. And I have lovely memories, Maggie, of that launch in the Centre Culturel not too long ago. And as we speak, New Island Books and Molly are launching Liberty Hall, a book of poetry written by Michael O'Loughlin in the Centre Culturel. So it's wonderful to see work written in the centre brought forth into the world. So a couple of events happening all at the same time. Back to Paris, however, and this evening's talk. And I'm delighted to say that it is chaired this evening by journalist and broadcaster Derval MacDonald, who is also secretary of the board of the Fondation Irlandaise and chair of the Centre Culturel Irlandais Strategy Committee. So I'm going to hand over now to our co-host, Camille Dumas, responsable éditorial traduction et non-fiction with Belfond. And bonne soirée à toutes et à tous.
Thank you, Nora, and thank you for organizing this evening, and thank you everyone to be here and to launch the French version of Hamnet. I'm very happy to say a few words, just a few words. I won't be long, but as Nora said, it's a long-term relationship between Belfond and Maggie. It's the 9th book. Hamnet is the 9th book we published in France and with Belfond, and it's a real pleasure to a publisher to have such a talented writer, and we are very proud because Maggie found a very great place in the literary scene in France. She has a great readership, and she's also very well known by journalists. And it's every book after book, we have a huge success and a lot of response from the French readers. So I'm very happy to be here and to publish Maggie book after books, and Hamnet is a very important book for us because it's quite different. It's an historical book, and there is some changing in the writing and in the poetry, but we find the theme of Maggie, like, speaking about family, motherhood, and women, and we find also these unforgettable characters like Agnes and Hamnet. So it's a very great book, and I will let Derval and Maggie speaking about it very much more than me, and with a very much English accent than me. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, Derval. And have a nice evening, everyone.
Okay, merci à vous, Camille, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in such huge numbers this evening. I think it's real testament to the interest in Maggie's work. She is beyond accomplished at this stage. Obviously the Women's Prize for Fiction, the Costa Prize, but also Maggie, amongst your many accomplishments, you're something of a recidivist at the Centre Culturel Irlandais. This is certainly not your first engagement with us, but you're very welcome back.
Thank you so much. I only wish I was there in person. I would love to be having a glass of wine in that courtyard this evening, but maybe one day soon.
Yeah, but but actually, obviously this is your 9th novel with Belfond, but you've been engaged with us. You've been to the Centre, including when your children were actually quite young.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure I've done an event at the Centre with every book, actually. And I was saying that I have pictures of my son, who's now a 6-foot 17-year-old. I have pictures of him as a very tiny toddler running around the courtyard and playing with the statues and things. So no, it's a place absolutely beautiful, and I cannot wait to be back there in Paris, and yeah, with all of you in person.
I know, and me as well. Coming to you from North Dublin, but wishing very much that I was in Paris this evening. So what can I say by virtue of introduction? Maggie, every so often a book comes along that just kind of blows it away. And that's what Hamnet was for me. It was one of my, what I call my reels, my read in one sitting. Is it's a bit where you kind of forget about everything else. You're on the sofa, and if you make it to the bathroom or a tea break, you've had a good day. I could not put this book down. And one of the first questions I want to ask you is, I know you've had this fascination. Obviously, the story, for anyone who hasn't read it, is about the death of Shakespeare's young son, Hamlet. But from what I can gather, this relationship has been with you from quite a young age. Like, you encountered Hamlet as a teenager, but this story has been with you, it seems to me, through all stages of your writing life, from those very early days.
Yeah, well, I was lucky actually, because I had, I was lucky in many ways actually, because I had a really fantastic English teacher at school. And we studied the play Hamlet when I was 16 for my Scottish Highers. And, and he just mentioned in passing, I mean, the play really got under my skin in a way that other Shakespeare plays hadn't. I really felt that Hamlet was somebody who kind of related to me. I think he does appeal to a certain type of adolescent, maybe one that is a little bit gloomy and melancholic, wears a lot of black, and certainly in my case wore a lot of black eyeliner. So I was definitely one of those teenagers. And, Hamlet felt like he was part of my DNA. But then my teacher mentioned in passing one day that Shakespeare had a son called Hamnet, who had died about 4 or 5 years when he was age 11, about 4 or 5 years before Shakespeare went on to write the play Hamlet. And I remember just being very struck by the similarity of the names. I remember, I have a strong memory of looking down at the school issue play on my desk and putting my finger over the L and thinking, well, it's the same name, and what does that mean? And then it was only when later, I went to university and I studied literature, and I, read an awful lot about Shakespeare. And it was only then really that I started to appreciate the fact that Shakespeare is a very mysterious person. As a human being, he's a very mysterious and quite a shadowy figure. On the one hand, we have this enormous wealth of plays and poetry, but on the other hand, we know very, very little about him, the man. We only have 6 examples of his signature, and he's left a very scant paper trail, a very scant account of himself. There are all these huge gaps in his story and his biography that, even despite the efforts of the world's very best scholars, no one's ever been able to fill these sort of slight mysteries. So it's just always seemed to me, ever since that time, is that, in calling this play After Your Dead Son, this play and the tragic hero, and also a ghost, let's not forget, After Your Dead Son, it seems like an enormously significant act. And it just seems that in that act, he becomes briefly visible to us as a person, as a human being, as a grieving father, and I've read biographers dismissing Hamlet. I've always felt that Hamlet, the boy, has been overlooked by history. He's been underplayed. He's never been given his significance. Not enough people, I've always felt, know about him, know about this boy whose name has been given to the play, because in Elizabethan times, spelling was a lot less stable, and they are the same name. They are fully interchangeable in all sorts of records and parish records and documents. So he did use his son's name for this play. And, a lot of scholars have kind of said, well, it's impossible to understand whether or not he was thinking of his son when he named the play. To which I just want to kind of shake them and say, are you joking? How could anyone casually use their dead son's name for a play, write it over and over again in a manuscript, hear it again and again during the rehearsal, speak it yourself, because, there is a story that Shakespeare himself took the part of the ghost in the first production of Hamlet. Nobody would do that lightly, because it's a name of such enormous significance to him. So I wanted to write this book. Sorry, this is a very long answer to your question. I wanted to know.
I've been dying to know this.
To sort of dignify the life of this boy that I think has been forgotten. He's been relegated to a literary footnote. I wanted to put him center stage and say to the readers, this boy was important. We wouldn't have Hamlet without him. We probably wouldn't have Twelfth Night.
Before we get on to that, sorry, I'm terrible. I just got straight into the question. So I forgot to say, this is a conversation. So wherever you are, please send your questions in either in the Q&A or the chat function, and we will try and get to them as often as we can. But I want to come back to you, Maggie, on that, because let's say the seed for Hamlet was sown, maybe ostensibly when you were a teenager. What happened then kind of between then, because you have a huge substantial body of work between it? Was it, how did the book choose you? Did it kind of develop when you were in university, kind of, asking those questions? And obviously, because you've had this great volume of work, but was it always something just in the back of your mind? Was Hamlet coming back at you almost like a ghost saying, write me?
I mean, I think it was something that has been haunting me in a sense, but I didn't for a long time think that I could or would write a novel about it. I've just seen someone saying, please not to speak so fast. I'm sorry, I do speak very fast. I will try and slow down a bit.
And we apologise because you've two Northern Ireland women in a room. We will. Thank you very much for that. We will speak.
Please say again if I'm talking too fast. My husband says you're talking too fast as well. Everybody does. So what are we talking about now? Hamnet. Yeah. So I don't know at what point I decided to write a novel about it, but it certainly is an idea that I've had for a while. But obviously, writing a novel about Shakespeare isn't something you undertake lightly. There were a few times when I had this idea and I circled around it and I thought, no, I can't do that. Who does that? Who writes a book about Shakespeare? And then I did decide to have a go. I had decided to have a shot at it, and I started researching it, and I did make I started a few sort of paragraphs or chapters in a document, and then I sort of shied away from it. And I think actually I have written 3 books instead of writing Hamnet. But one of the things that really stopped me was a kind of odd superstition. I'm not really a superstitious person, but I was very reluctant to write this book, which is about the death of an 11-year-old boy, because I couldn't do it until my own son was past the age of 11. I just had this, because I knew that in order to write it, I was going to have to put myself inside the mind of a woman who sits at her son's bedside and is forced to watch him die. And even though there's never been a huge risk of my son contracting the plague, you never know, you can't be too careful. So I just couldn't, and I kept putting it off and putting it off. And then when I finished writing my memoir, whenever it was, about 3 or 4 years ago now, I sort of sat myself down and I looked myself in the eye and I said, you've either got to do this or you've got to forget about it. You can't keep circling around this idea about this lost boy, Elizabethan boy. So I thought, well, I'll just give it a shot and see what happens. And then, I can just move on. So I got out the document that I'd already started that had maybe about 15,000 words. And I realized that I'd started in completely the wrong place. And I wanted to start with him, with Hamnet, to put him center stage. The only other time I've ever seen him mentioned is in Ulysses. So James Joyce, he mentions him really, really briefly in Ulysses. And so I thought, but that's not enough. I want him to be the main character. I want him to be center stage. The novel has to start with him. And as soon as I started the scene with him, it just seemed to unlock something and everything fell into place, and I was able to write the book.
So was the reticence then, the reticence wasn't about, because you've taken the world's most famous dramaturg. We might not know an awful lot about Shakespeare in terms of biographical kind of detail or details of his life, but he is this huge literary figure, and yet in the book he is side stage nearly. He's off stage but very much present, but we never hear his name uttered. We never hear it mentioned, but we all know. And was that was there a reticence about taking him on as a figure, or was that very, very deliberate, not to give this person who has so much agency after his death, agency at the time, if that isn't too strange a question?
No, not at all. I mean, actually, for me, the book is about names. It's very concerned with names and naming and our connection to our names and how names can become disconnected from us and how they can assume an importance which is outside of us. Hamnet's name is so familiar to us, isn't it? It's overpoweringly familiar, but obviously not as familiar as his father's name. I think probably, the name William Shakespeare is probably one of the best known in the whole world. I think there's probably very few people over the age of, say, 10 who have never heard of him, and I don't think there's anyone else really like that, especially someone from 400 years ago. It's a name that carries so much heft and association and weight. All of us have our own relationship with Shakespeare inside our head. He pervades the very language that we use. So, taking him on as a fictional character, I did have a certain amount. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my children shouting in the background. I apologize for that. It's bath time. So there was quite a lot of vertigo about that, certainly. But I think, in a sense, what I wanted to do really was to ask readers to sort of forget everything they think they know about him, this literary icon, this behemoth of plays, and just try to see him as a man. And so I decided just to take his name away entirely, because, and partly because I couldn't actually write a fictional sentence with his name in it without thinking, well, what am I doing? I must be out of my mind. If you try to write a sentence like, I don't know, William Shakespeare came down the stairs and had breakfast, instantly you feel like an Egypt. and you just, you're pulled up out of the narrative. And, I realized that if I, as the writer, couldn't stay submerged within the world of the book, I couldn't expect readers to, if they came across that name. So I just decided to do away with his name altogether. So the name Shakespeare never appears in the book. The name William or Will or any of those other nicknames don't appear at all. And I just have him as the father or the Latin tutor or the brother or whatever he is. It seemed to me it was simpler that way, to in a way to find sort of a way to fictionalize him and to see him as a person, as a human being.
And very much so, and one of an experience of which you articulate, certainly in the early stages of the book, is the relationship that he had with his father.
Yeah, I mean, actually, his father, if we contrast how many documents there are about William, which are very, very few, with how many there are about his father, John Shakespeare, it's astonishing. His father has left this enormous paper trail, mainly through legal problems. So his father, to me, was quite an intriguing figure. I mean, I characterize him in the book as quite a violent, erratic sort of personality. I mean, it's quite possible that I owe John Shakespeare an apology. It's possible that he and William got on brilliantly and they loved each other. I don't know. But actually, looking at all the documentation to do with John Shakespeare, I got this impression of this quite erratic person, because, at the time, when Shakespeare was a child, his father was a very successful businessman. He was the town's most successful glover, and they were very wealthy. And John Shakespeare bought one of the biggest houses in town in Henley Street, which you can still see to this day, where William and his siblings were born. But, in the course of William's life, up until the point at which he got married at the age of 18, his father's and the family fortunes took quite a steep nosedive, because his father began legally trading in wool. So in those days, you had to stay within your trade, within your guild. And if you went outside it and traded in something other than what you were already commissioned to, you were in big trouble. So his father got into huge amounts of debt and owed money all over the town. He got summoned to court for really peculiar things, like not attending church. So he had to go to church once a week. In those days, it was against the law not to. So he got summoned several times for not attending church. He also got fined for things like, there's a description of him, having to appear in court and pay a fine because he dumped a heap of ordure on the street outside his house. I don't really want to go into what that might be. I think we can all imagine. But, I just got this picture of this man who had this big kind of fall from grace. So he had been a high alderman, which was a very important civic and religious sort of status in the town. And it just this big fall from fortune into financial difficulty. He owed money all over town. There was an account that I read saying that he very rarely left the house because he was so worried about bumping into his creditors. So and there was something about that echoed in the plays for me, because a lot of Shakespeare's plays feature particularly men, perhaps reaching a certain age whose reach exceeds their grasp, and they're brought down by their ambition, and they turn quite vicious. They turn against those around them and they blame other people. I'm thinking of Coriolanus and Titus Andronicus, Macbeth, King Lear, and just there is a certain type of personality which recurs again and again in his play. And so I matched that with my John Shakespeare in the book.
The young Hamnet encounters this dynamic very early on in his life, but also very early on in the book. And I think I did invite you to perhaps maybe just to read for us a little bit of a section, but I think that, as I understand it, maybe that was one of the little sort of interactions you'd honed in on. And I'm right, it's from one of the earlier parts of the book.
So this is right from the beginning, the first chapter, where Hamnet has discovered that his twin sister Judith is unwell, and he's looking for someone to help him. But the house appears to be empty, but he does come across, unfortunately, his grandfather. The room is filled with gloom, coverings pulled over most of the windows. His grandfather is standing with his back towards him in a crouched position, fumbling with something, papers, a cloth bag, counters of some sort. There is a pitcher on the table and a cup. His grandfather's hand meanders through these objects, his head bent, his breath coming in wheezing bursts. Hamnet gives a polite cough. His grandfather wheels around, his face wild, furious, his arm flailing through the air as if warding off an assailant. "Who's there?" he cries. "It's me, Hamnet." His grandfather sits down with a thud. "You scared the wits out of me," he cries. "Whatever do you mean, creeping about like that?" "I'm sorry," Hamnet says. "I was calling and calling, but no one answered. Judith is unwell and they've gone out." His grandfather speaks over him with a curt flick of his wrist. "What do you want with all those women anyway?" He seizes the neck of the pitcher and aims it towards the cup. The liquid, ale, Hamnet thinks, slops out precipitously, some into the cup and some onto the papers on the table, causing his grandfather to curse, then dab at them with his sleeve. For the first time, it occurs to Hamnet that his grandfather might be drunk. "Do you know where they've gone?" Hamnet asks. "Eh?" his grandfather says, still mopping his papers. His anger at their spoiling seems to unsheath itself and stretch out from him like a rapier. Hamnet can feel the tip of it wander about the room, seeking an opponent. "Don't stand there gulping," his grandfather hisses. "Help me." Hamnet shuffles forward a step, then another. He is wary, his father's words circling his mind. Stay away from your grandfather when he's in one of his black humours. Be sure to stand clear of him. Stay well back, do you hear? His father had said this to him on his last visit, when they'd been helping unload a cart from the tannery. John, his grandfather, had dropped a bundle of skins into the mud and, in a sudden fit of temper, had hurled a paring knife at the yard wall. His father had immediately pulled Hamnet back behind him out of the way, but John had barged past them into the house without a word. His father had taken Hamnet's face in both of his hands, fingers curled in at the nape of his neck, his gaze steady and searching. "He'll not touch your sisters, but it's you I worry for," he had muttered, his brow puckering. "Swear to me," his father had said as they stood there. "Swear it. I need to know you'll be safe when I'm not here to see to it." Hamnet believes he is keeping his word. He is at the other side of the fireplace. His grandfather couldn't reach him here, even if he tried. His grandfather is draining his cup with one hand and shaking the drops off a sheet of paper with the other. "Take this," he orders, holding out the page. Hamnet bends forward, not moving his feet, and takes it with the very tips of his fingers. His grandfather's eyes are slitted, watchful. His tongue pokes out the side of his mouth. He sits in his chair, hunched, an old, sad toad on a stone. "And this." His grandfather holds out another paper. Hamnet bends forward in the same way, keeping the necessary distance. He thinks of his father, how he would be proud of him, how he would be pleased. But quick as a fox, his grandfather makes a lunge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. I've been listening to the audiobook version, and there are just certain points when you're listening, when I'm driving in the car, and the encounters with the grandfather, you can nearly see the hand coming, or you can see that quick action. Let's talk about, before we get on to the central event, the death of Hamnet, because what you've already spoken about is, in fact, what we're introduced is to his twin being sick. And I think part of the reason why this was a heart-stopping novel for me is that I am a twin, and it can be very difficult sometimes to explain the nature of that relationship, but this is what you do so well. You're exploring all of those bonds, and at times I wondered, and we're going to speak about her shortly, is Hamnet the main protagonist, or is it Agnes, or is it both? Because they have both such a powerful pull in this, but that exploration of the relationship between the twins, I know you've done so much historical research, again we'll speak about that, but what was your process of imagining that relationship, because you caught it so profoundly well?
Oh, well, thank you, that's very nice. I mean, I think it was two things really. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of twins in my family. My father is a twin. He's a boy-girl twin, and actually his twin sister died last year. So it's really, I know it's really heartbreaking. He had his first birthday without her. He just turned 80 2 weeks ago, and he said it's the first birthday I've ever had without her. So that was heartbreaking. But no, there are lots of twins in my family, so it is something I've observed. But also I would say that a lot of the relationship between Judith and Hamnet in my novel comes from the plays again, because of course boy and girl twins is a recurring motif in Shakespeare's work. You find it again and again. In particular, Twelfth Night, which is the play that Shakespeare wrote after he wrote Hamlet, or it's dated as him writing it after Hamlet. And of course, as I'm sure you know, Twelfth Night is about boy and girl twins who at the start of the play are separated, and each of them think the other one is dead. And for the entire length of the play, the whole sort of act of the play, they both think the other is dead. And there's this kind of, I mean, obviously Shakespeare plays it as comedy. They are mistaken for each other. They put on each other's clothes and they dress up as a boy and a girl and they're mistaken for each other. They fall in love with the wrong people. And then right towards the end, they are magically reunited and they realize that the other one isn't dead. And there's this beautiful reunion scene of them coming back together, which when you read that, through the lens of Shakespeare having lost Hamnet, you know, the boy twin and his family. It's absolutely heart-wrenching. And one of the really sad moments when I was doing my research is that I saw a playbill for the original production of Twelfth Night. And as I was looking at it, I thought there's something really familiar about that date, the date of the opening night. And I realized it was on what would have been the twins' birthday. I know. It's one of those really odd moments where, a bit like when you think about him calling the play after his dead son, there's this kind of strange frisson, and you think, there he is, that's him, there he is. You can see him, and you know, obviously he was one of the main players in the King's Men, and he could have chosen any date at all he wanted for the opening night of Twelfth Night, but he chose that one.
And what I want to talk to you about as well, because obviously the twins and that bond that they have, you know, there's a very, very sad line after Hamlet dies where Judith says to the mum, you know, well, I know what a widow is and I know what an orphan is, but what's the word for someone who was a twin, who is no longer a twin? She goes, what is the word for what I am? But it really speaks to the sacrifices that these twins make, and that supernatural element of Hamlet taking her place, because Judith, of course, was the one who was initially sick.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that, again, that comes from the plays. And, you know, I always wanted this idea that, because I think I was very struck when I was researching the lives of particularly the daughters. So Susanna is their elder sister and Judith. Susanna and Judith live an extraordinarily long time. So poor little Hamnet only lives 11 years. Judith lives till her early 70s, which in the early 17th century is astonishing. You know, the life expectancy was 48, which is how old I am, you know, so I would have been an old crone then. Susanna lives till she's in her late 60s. I mean, it is astonishing. So I just got this idea that actually, you know, Judith almost had two lives in a sense for that time in history. And I got the idea that she was living Hamlet's life as well. She got his years extra. So it was more that it came from. But I think also, you know, there is a kind of hint of supernature or second sight throughout the novel, but that again comes from the plays. You know, I keep saying, because there's an awful lot of prophecy and second sight and magic in Shakespeare's work. You know, I'm thinking of the witches in Macbeth or in Julius Caesar. There's a lot of prophecy, and you know, it does go through. I mean, I think, and also I think when you're writing historically, you've got to remember that the different kind of perspectives, you know, you can't impose modern sensibilities on them. And I think their lives were much more closely tied to the natural cycles of the world, and also the sort of supernatural cycles. I think there was an awful lot more superstition, even though it was absolutely compulsory to go to church. I think that there were probably underneath that, there were all these countercurrents of belief to do with nature and supernature. So I wanted to tap into that.
Yeah, which really brings us to I suppose the central character in your book, and it's Agnes, not Agnes, but Shakespeare's wife, who you know, and she does have that supernatural capacity, that link with nature. She is, you know, viewed with suspicion, not least by her stepmother, but she is derided, and yet people come to her door looking for cures. And she has this extraordinary sixth sense, including when she's pregnant with the twins, where she sees a vision. Okay, on my deathbed I have 2 children, but she can't work out because she has twins and Susanna, so it's 3. And you know, so this incredible sixth sense, and that I imagined her, if anybody has read the book, they will know that she does this thing with people's hands. And reading the book, I could nearly feel someone come up and I kind of drain the energy. But what was it like, if the word isn't, it's a bit of a supernatural word, but channeling her in particular, because she has been demonized in history?
Yeah, I mean, actually, you know, I always thought, you know, before I started writing the book or sort of seriously researching it, I always imagined that it would be about fathers and sons, as of course the play is, and ghosts. So I thought it would be about haunting. You know, I imagined that I was going to write a book about a little boy ghost. But actually, if you've read the book, you'll realize that actually they try to find his ghost, but of course they can't. You know, and that to me actually seemed, when in the act of writing, it seemed more upsetting in the sense of the fact they want to see him but can't. But in a sense, you know, I got sort of sidetracked, I suppose you describe, by my research about his wife, you know, the woman we've been taught to call Anne Hathaway. You know, I was absolutely unprepared and very shocked for how she has been treated by history and by scholarship and historians and other novelists, writers of Oscar-winning screenplays. You know, we have been taught one very single, clear narrative about her for the last 400 years, and that is that she was an ignorant peasant who trapped a young boy genius into marriage, that he had to go away to London to get away from her, that he hated her, that he regretted his marriage, that, you know, I mean, all this stuff, you will find it everywhere. It's absolutely universal, apart from Germaine Greer, who wrote a book called Shakespeare's Wife in support of her, and also Carol Ann Duffy, the Scottish poet, who wrote an absolutely beautiful sonnet called Shakespeare's Wife. It's about the second best bed, you know. But I was just absolutely shocked. You know, there was nothing that I could find in any of the research to support this theory at all. I don't quite know why or where this comes from, this idea or this urge for people that had for so long to give Shakespeare a retrospective divorce. You know, they're determined that this marriage should be, you know, dissolved, that we shouldn't believe in it, that he hated her. And, you know, I just found it so baffling. You know, it just seemed to be absolute base misogyny and opprobrium. You know, if we think we know little about Shakespeare, we know even less about his wife. You know, we know that she was 3 months pregnant or thereabouts when they got married. We know that she was 26 to his 18, although there isn't actually a record of her birth because she was born before records began. We know that she had 3 children, and we know that she died, and that's pretty much it. There's not a great deal else, but that hasn't stopped people from rushing forward to heap all this disapproval and opprobrium on her head. So I was so outraged. And, you know, people will always bring up the famous behest from Shakespeare's will, you know, I leave unto my wife my second best bed. But what people, her detractors, never mention is that in law at the time, she was entitled automatically to a third of his estate, which was a vast amount of money. He was incredibly wealthy by the end of his life. So the idea that she was this kind of hated wife thrown out on the street with just a bed to her name is preposterous. You know, she was able to stay in the house until the end of her own natural life. But also the thing that is most significant for me is at the end of his career, when he retired from the stage in London, he was, as I said, incredibly wealthy. He was the equivalent of a multimillionaire. He could have set up a household anywhere he wanted in the world, but he was still living in very modest single room lodgings in London. All his money had been sent back to Stratford, where he bought his wife and daughters a huge house. He had fields and cottages and land that he leased out. But at the end of his career, he chose to come back to spend his retirement in Stratford with his wife, which, you know, isn't what you do if you hate your wife and you regret your marriage. It just always seemed to me that those details signify that his heart was in Stratford with her, which isn't the story that we've ever been told.
But it is an extraordinary exploration, even if it is fiction and imagined, the relationship between them. And one of the moments that sort of stunned me was when they've just walked through the streets carrying the body of Hamnet. You know, they've buried him, and she's talking about how that walk is both simultaneously too fast and too slow. And then after the funeral, he goes back to London because he's just like, people are relying on me. I have my players. And just how she is sort of, you know, but you get a sense that he did go off and build up this amazing career whilst she kept the home fires burning.
Well, I think that, I mean, the thing is, you know, if you look at the Paris records, it wasn't actually that unusual for the men of the households in rural Warwickshire to go to London to work, just as it isn't now. You know, I mean, it isn't, you know, his biographers will make this huge deal out of the fact that he went to London to work as if he's the only person who ever did it because he hated his wife. But it's nonsense. Lots and lots of men did it, you know, lots of the men in the household. So it's not unusual. And I think, you know, heartbreaking though it is, I think he probably did go back to London quite soon. I mean, we don't know, obviously, but there is a playbill of the King's Men being on tour in Kent the summer that Hamnet died. So it's not actually known whether or not he made it back in time for Hamlet's funeral, which is quite hard to know. But, you know, I think he was obviously very busy. You know, summer season was high. So I don't know. I don't know if he went back or not. I may have been unfair on him there.
Let's talk about the level of research and the historical research, because as Camille said at the outset, you know, what was kind of maybe new for Belfond is that it's still channeling some of your big themes, motherhood, you know, grief, looking at those issues, but it's a historical novel without being really showy offy or about it. Like, I mean, so that, you know, I was half expecting to open the book and go, whether us now are we, or, you know, something kind of written very Elizabethan, and yet it's very, very conversational, and it hasn't sort of veered off into that. And the level of research in it is amazing. Like, I mean, the journey you went on with the flea in Alexandria, and now it got back to Judith when he went into the boxes of beads. And again, for anyone who's read it, you just have to, especially in these times with a global pandemic, but that level of, look, how long did this book take to go in and do that level of research on fleas or on the history or on Stratford?
Well, I think it was, you know, I mean, I think the thing about research is, you know, the kind of historical books that I like to read are the ones that wear their history very lightly. You know, I really don't like to have, you know, to read what appears to be a novel, but actually is a sort of dressed up PhD, perhaps, of the novelist. You know, I think it's the opposite of what your maths teachers always told you. You know, you shouldn't show your workings. You know, I think that, you know, I just feel frustrated when I read a novel and I feel as though the writer wants me to know, or is shoveling in all the information that they have possibly found about this. So I think, you know, there's a strange balance to be made, I felt anyway, when I was writing Hamnet. You know, in order to there are people in an Elizabethan parlor talking to each other. You need to know so much before you can write it with confidence. You need to know what the floor's made of. You need to know what clothes are wearing. You need to know what the hair is. You need to know what the walls look like. But actually, you need to know it, but you need to leave out, say, 98% of it, because you don't want to weigh down your narrative with all this weight, you know, with all the
it's a question we actually have from Celine Thobois, if I have pronounced that. Thank you, Celine. We're getting lots of questions in, but one of the questions that Celine has said is that she really loved the description of space, and she had an experience of synesthesia at the start of the novel when Hamlet and Wee Pardy entered the grandfather's workshop. She said you mainly described sounds, but she could feel the smells. That was really powerful, and that essentially, she said, wants to know, can you tell her more about the senses in the process of writing and in that connection with the imagination? So was it a mix of that historical research and then just, because I know you actually went and visited the home where Shakespeare was born.
Yeah, I did actually, and I would urge anybody, if they've even got a slight interest in Shakespeare or literature, to go and see the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon when we are allowed to do such things, because it is an absolutely magical experience. You know, it seems so extraordinary that for a man about whom we know so little, that you can buy a ticket and you can walk into the house where he was born. You know, you can stand in the room where he ate his dinner. You can go upstairs to the room where literally his mother gave birth. You know, I mean, it is astonishing. It's really worth going. But I think, you know, I've always felt, and it's funny, I think it goes back to a long time ago, when I was in my 20s. I wanted to be a poet, and I used to go to poetry classes given by the Irish American poet Michael Donaghy, who was an absolutely brilliant teacher. He was wonderful. I still to this day think about the advice he gave me for writing at least once a week. And I have one of my most treasured possessions is a notebook I took in his classes. It's full of his advice. But he always invoked, I think it was Wallace Stevens who said, no ideas, but in things. And it's talking about how you communicate detail is not describing the thing, but describing the idea of it, describing the impression of it. And I do think detail is the way to do that. You need a kind of immediacy, you know, especially if you're going to animate people who lived so long ago. You know, their lives are so distant from us and so unfamiliar to ours. You need to have something that a reader can sort of grasp. So something like the smell of leather or the sound of a horse, or it's just something that feels familiar that they can get a foothold in the narrative. So it just always seemed to me that it had to be specific. You know, you need those specifics in order to bring it to life. Much better to put that than just lots of information about how gloves were made, which I could tell you if you're interested, but I'm not going to put it in the book.
That connection, though, between nature and the supernatural is very, very strong. Look, do you have an interest in nature, or what made you go down that road? Because essentially, I suppose Agnes is, I don't know, what would we call her now, not quite a faith healer, but she has kind of got that, you know, people come to her and it's all about the herbs and the poultices and even the bees, the description of the bees. What made you kind of bring that nature and kind of mix it with her, what I suppose for many people are sort of her supernatural capacities?
Well, I think in a sense, you know, I wanted in a way to introduce the reader to a Mrs. Shakespeare they haven't yet met. You know, I wanted them to forget everything they think they know about the peasant who, you know, got pregnant and lured this boy into marriage. And, you know, I'm using her changing her name in a sense was sort of emblematic of that, you know, because we've always known her as Anne Hathaway, but I read, one of the documents I read was her father's will. So her father, Richard Hathaway, was quite a successful sheep farmer, and he died a year before she married William. And in his will, he leaves her a pretty generous dowry, and he describes her as my daughter Agnes, or Agnes, as it would have been pronounced then. And I was absolutely, it was like being struck by a bolt of lightning. I thought, you know, as well as everything else, we've probably been calling her by the wrong name for all the time. You know, surely her father would know what her name is. So I wanted to give this back to her as a kind of, as a sign to readers that this is somebody new, this is somebody you haven't met. So, and I like the idea of their marriage being a partnership, to being a kind of exchange of information and different types of artistry. And I suppose there were two things about her really, you know, that obviously I think the play Hamlet is a play in which Shakespeare himself is more visible in that play. He's closer to the surface as a person than he is in a lot of his other work. I'm thinking particularly of the scene where Hamlet instructs the players in how to speak his lines with the play within a play, the play he devises to catch the king's conscience. But you know, you hear him saying, you know, please, this is how you pronounce my words, trippingly off the tongue, and you think, my God, there he is. that's William. That's William speaking. That's not Hamlet. And one of the scenes which has always intrigued me is when the sad scene actually where Ophelia is mad and she's handing plants to people. Handing flowers and plants, and all those plants are a contemporary cure for a flaw that she perceives in their characters. So Shakespeare obviously wrote that with a great and deep knowledge of herbology of the time, and I know from my research that was something that the women of the household would have had. It would have been the sort of purview of the woman. So I just love the idea that maybe Shakespeare got that from his wife.
Yeah, and had all of that to hand. There's lots of questions about your writing process and the research that you did for it. And I think it's Annette Charles. And again, thank you, everybody. Keep your questions coming in. I'll try and get as many. Annette has asked, she wanted to know more about your writing process in terms of, since the story you did write was not the original idea that you had of the story of a ghost, was it, again, maybe just give us an idea in terms of where the story took shape? Like, I mean, was it that you made a decision and decided, right, this is now the story, and then did you do all of your historical research, or was it sort of an iterative process? Because obviously your deep love of Shakespeare is something that's been with you, and those stories and those plays have been with you for a very long time. It seems that you dip in and out of the stories of Shakespeare's work himself to inform this novel.
I mean, I think I would say that all the novels I write are and often end up in their final version to be quite different from what I set out to do, you know, and that doesn't bother me. I always welcome that moment. You know, it's very often that I mean, I think probably in life and in writing, I'm not much of a planner. I don't tend to plan or be very organized. So I often think, oh, you know, this novel is going to go from A to B, and that's what it's going to be. But often, sort of maybe a quarter or half the way through, the novel sort of takes up its own momentum, and it says, actually, we're not going to B, we're going to C or D. And I always welcome that moment, because it feels as though it's the moment where the novel is assuming, sort of acquiring its own pulse, its own heartbeat. It's always a good point for me anyway, that the material will take over. I always sort of trust that narratives will take shape, they take their own shape. They will fill the space that they need to. So you have to trust it. So it does change. I mean, and the book I'm writing now is changing as well. You know, I think all my books in a sense have done that. It just is the way I work. You know, I've heard other writers say that they meticulously plan every single chapter before they even start to write. So I think whatever works for people. But certainly I did, you know, I found particularly with this book, there's a lot of research that I did in libraries, because there's no shortage of books about Shakespeare. So there was a lot of that, but also I did a lot of physical research, particularly for the female characters, actually, whose lives are pretty much undocumented in books. So I wanted to quite literally get my hands dirty. And in order to sort of get under the skin of Agnes, I planted and grew my own Elizabethan medicinal garden. And I'm not much of a gardener, I should say, but I did get the seeds, and I cultivated them, and I grew my own garden. And then I went on a course to find out how you make medicines, you know, how they would have made traditional medicines from these things. And I went on an archaeological dig along the Thames River in London, in all the Tudor sites, and I dug up coins, and I dug up a piece of a window from an Elizabethan ship, and I found the lots of the brass pins that they used to kind of hold their ruffs together and hold their hair up. But the most fun thing I did actually was that I went to meet a falconer and I learned to fly a kestrel.
Wow, because of course this is one of the kind of the supernatural things, you know, the Orion Stratford, like, is it true? Does she have a hawk? And, you know, can't you fly it? And it's kind of one of these mythical things around her. And also, look, I mean, there is nothing in this book that is wasted. Like, even the time you took with the young guy on the ship who is sent out on messages, who is distracted by a little monkey, and that's where we first meet the flea, who ultimately ends up, you know. And what really struck me was, I'm sure it couldn't have possibly maybe been contemplated when you were writing the book, but I think I was saying to you earlier that part of me is afraid of what we're going to see, kind of the great pandemic novels that come out, but the context for this book and for the time that Shakespeare lived in, you know, the context was a plague. It was the pestilence, it was the Black Death. The description that you have of, and my hands go to my neck in fear, but the description of the buboes that appeared on Judith and on others, and the fear that they lived with. But I think a lot of the explorations of the book have a resonance in this time. Hopefully we're coming out of it, but a real, was that an unexpected resonance that it had? You couldn't have planned it in terms of timing.
No, I certainly didn't see COVID coming. I wished I had, but I definitely didn't. No, I think I was just you know, struck by what a horrific pandemic the Black Death was, you know, and how it would have been absolutely at the forefront of every single Elizabethan's mind. You know, Shakespeare himself, his career would have been constantly interrupted by outbreaks of the Black Death, you know, because the very first thing that civic authorities in London would have done when there was a case of the plague in London, and of course there was lots, because think of all the Elizabethan trade going around the world, but the first thing they did was to shut down the playhouses. Because if you think that the original Globe Theatre had a capacity for 3,000 people, and they were all gathering in the middle of the day in the heat of summer, perhaps, you know, in July, and, you know, you can see why the civic authorities had identified the playhouses as very at-risk places, you know, places where the plague could run rife.
It also struck me he wouldn't do well in this time, because there's one point where they shut the playhouses in London and he moves them all to Kent, where people are still allowed to gather in large numbers. I thought, my goodness, they're like, oh no, we can't go to London, we'll go here. But it is an extraordinary theme, and the fear with which they lived, you know, at that time, and Agnes's frustration that all of her life's work, her herbs, her powers, all things is not enough to save Hamnet. I want to get, because I'm being so indulgent answering all of these questions. There's one from it says that is there a novel of yours that you hold closest to your heart? Because I suppose with Hamnet you have this extraordinary critical acclaim, and it has passed out into the world with all of this much deserved acclaim. But is it the one that you hold closest to your heart, or is it something else? Is it the next one?
I don't know. It's really hard actually to say if there's one. It would be a bit like asking me which of my children are my favorite, you know. Sort of feel they all my books are close to me in a way, and, you know, they all represent different times in my life. I certainly found it hard to move on from Hamnet, actually. I think I thought about this little boy for so long, and I usually have lots of pictures and maps and plans all up on the walls of my study that usually when I finish, I take them down within a month or so of finishing the book. But the Hamnet photographs and plans stayed up for a bit longer, and actually I still have on my pinboard a kestrel feather that I had, and also a photograph of the staircase in Henley Street where the novel starts. I think they'll always be there, but no, I wouldn't say there's one more than any others. I think the novel I always feel most optimistic about is the one I haven't started yet, because that one in my mind is completely perfect and nothing has gone wrong with it.
Oh wow, well, and I know I probably can't even probe that with you this evening. Can I ask you to go back just to because obviously a parent losing a child is something that is unimaginable then and now. Did your own experience of being sick as a young child, which I know you've written and spoken about, did that inform, you know, where were you when you were kind of writing from both, I suppose, the perspective of a child, but also the perspective of an adult who is losing a child? They were really deep, in-depth explorations. And I was just wondering, was your own experience of illness as a child, is that something, a place you went back to?
Probably. I mean, it's funny at the time. I think it was unconscious. If it was, I didn't really think about it. I mean, but actually now, when I think about it now, with a bit more distance between me and the book, I think I probably was. You know, it's inevitable if you're writing about, you know, a very strong fever, which of course is how the Black Death begins. I'm sure I probably was. But I mean, it sounds ridiculous for me to say no, I hadn't thought about it, but at the time I think it probably was a little bit unconscious. But you know, obviously a fever, you know, when I was 8, I had, just for anyone who doesn't know, I had encephalitis, which is a brain inflammation. So it was a very severe fever which I had for months and months. So fever is, and I suppose illness, and I don't know, the strangeness of illness is something that interests me, obviously, for obvious reasons, you know. And I do think that severe illness, going through a severe illness, is something that always changes you. You know, you're always a different person when you come out the other side. So I suppose it's inevitable that I was thinking about it, even though at the time it wasn't conscious.
Yeah. And even just what you said, you know, that you're not superstitious, but you did wait for your son to pass the age of 11 before you write it. Was that a difficult experience, even in fiction, to write from the perspective of a parent who loses her child? I mean, when you describe Agnes's grief afterwards, where she's talking literally about how she just wants to get into the ground and dig with her hands, you know, those are just really big moments.
I mean, it was, I think, in a sense, I really dreaded writing those scenes, you know. And I remember, you know, I do remember when I was writing the first half of the book, almost deliberately slowing down before, because I didn't want to reach those chapters, you know. I didn't, and also I'd become so attached to my you know, my fictional Hamnet. You know, the last thing I wanted to do was to write death. But unfortunately, you know, there is that line in the parish registers, and he did die in August, you know, 1596. So, and in a sense, I wanted the scenes to have an impact. I wanted them to feel awful for the reader to go through, in a sense, because, you know, I've always felt that his death has been underplayed. You know, the engine for me behind writing the book was to dignify this child's short life, and to say that, yes, he was grieved, you know, he was important, you know, he mattered, this death mattered, it was hugely significant, not only to us as an audience, but also to his family. You know, how could they not have grieved him? You know, I was always struck by going back to the biographies of Shakespeare, that people, you know, Hamlet's lucky if he gets maybe 2 mentions in one of these biographies. They mention he was born, they mention he died, and his death is always wrapped up in statistics about child mortality in the 16th century, which of course was very high, but almost as if the implication is that, oh, you know, it wouldn't have mattered that much because people were half expecting it. And, you know, I find that such terrible assumption, because I refuse to believe that anywhere in history, anywhere in the world, it's anything less than catastrophic for a parent to lose a child.
Can I talk to you about just lockdown, just generally? There was a brilliant piece in the New York Times describing what we're going through. It said, we're not depressed, but we're not flourishing. So we're sort of languishing. How was lockdown for you, living obviously with your husband, who's also a novelist, and your children? How has that experience for you? Has it been a creative time? Have you just kept it going in terms of your writing and your productivity?
I mean, in some ways, you know, I think writers were lucky in a sense, because we had a lot less to adjust to, you know, because we're quite used to working from home. I think what we weren't that used to was homeschooling 3 children, that's for sure. But, you know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, everybody had different struggles, didn't they? Everybody was struggling different ways with different things. I mean, we are and you know, continue to be very lucky. All 5 of us were well, and the grandparents were well, and, you know, we have a house, we have a roof over our heads, we have a garden. And I think, you know, I cannot imagine how people were homeschooling without a little bit of outdoor space in which their kids could let off steam, and, you know, we had enough food. So we were definitely in the very, very lucky category. But at the same time, it's hard. You know, it was hard for our lives to be so curtailed, and to, you know, to deal with all the stress and the worry and the fear, and, you know, helping your children through it. You know, I think the effect, certainly the psychological effect on the younger generation, is going to be immense. And I think, you know, it's going to be a while, you know, until we really understand that, until this plays out. So, and I also feel, you know, I think at the moment we're in a strange scenario. I can't remember what the rules are in Ireland and France, but in Scotland we're just emerging from a lockdown. The schools have opened again, and the shops opened 2 days ago. But everybody's being quite cautious, you know, nobody's quite sure what we're allowed. We've sort of forgotten what we're allowed to do or not allowed to do. So I think cautious and optimistic at the same time is how everyone's feeling at the moment.
How do you think writers, artists will record and reflect this period? You know, how long does it take before you can kind of write the great, you know, I don't know, global financial crisis novel, or the great, you know, pandemic novel?
I don't know. I think it'll take a while. You know, I think I think it must be, I'm glad in a way that I wasn't writing about the contemporary world when all this happened, because actually we don't really yet know what the world is going to be like when, hopefully, and when we get through to the other side of this. We don't know what the world's going to be like, you know, and I think if I was writing a contemporary novel, I'd be quite anxious, because you'd think, well, you know, is the world going to be the same by the time I finish this book? So I feel relieved inside. I'm writing another historical book, so I'm relieved in a sense that this isn't relevant, because I think it's going to take a long time for the effects of COVID, mentally anyway, and in terms of society, I think it's going to take a long time for them to percolate through and for us to reach whatever our new normal is going to be.
I have a question. It's nothing to do with Elizabethan England or pandemics, but just to speak to one of the other big issues at the moment, which is kind of Brexit, the future of Europe, the United Kingdom. You know, I look at, you know, born in Coleraine, but you've lived and been part of every part of the UK. And I was just wondering, how do you view things now in this extraordinary moment we are in, and now that France is in fact Ireland's closest European neighbour, strictly speaking. But how have you perceived all of that, having been exposed to so much in Scotland in particular? My goodness, could be the big player.
I don't know. I mean, I am not a fan of Brexit. I'm not worried about saying that. You know, I voted against it. I am clinging very, very tightly to my Irish passport. So I'm still, and I got them for my kids, you know, because I want to continue being in the EU. And, you know, I think it's just awful what's happening in Northern Ireland at the moment. The idea that, you know, there's all this sectarian violence and this resurgence. And, you know, I feel furious in a sense, because, you know, you want to say to the politicians, did you not see this coming? You know, it's, you know, you're constructing a border again. You know, how could you not have, you know, put in place, there were some stopgaps for this, some, you know, it's so frustrating. And and what's going on in Westminster at the moment with Boris Johnson is just horrifying. And there's all this allegations of sleaze and lying in the Scottish government. I mean, it feels very insecure, I think, the politics certainly of the UK at the moment. You know, I have no idea what's going to happen. I've literally no idea. I mean, COVID aside, you don't know what you do when you open up the newspaper in the morning. You have no idea what you're going to see. And it's not a good feeling to have, that you cannot trust any of the politicians in power.
Yeah, no, I think it's an extraordinary moment we find ourselves in. Can I bring you back before I let you go? Just one or two more question is, now this is an interesting one. Since Cervantes and Shakespeare died in the same year, and both were brilliant writers, notwithstanding the plague and all of the difficulties in Elizabethan England time, do you think there was a lot of creativity around that time in the late 1550s to kind of 1616? Like, I mean, the Shakespeare's output was prolific.
It certainly was. I mean, I think Shakespeare, in a sense, also was living through a period of great instability, you know, and perhaps maybe that feeds into creativity. Who knows? You know, I think he never writes particularly directly about the issues of, you know, the late Elizabethan era, but a lot of his plays are concerned with the anxieties about succession and what's going to happen when one ruler transfers to another, when a state is rulerless. And you know, it doesn't take a genius to work out where that is coming from. So I think he and himself was living in a time of great instability, and also, you know, huge pandemics. I mean, the Black Death was an appalling pandemic, and it's, you know, at one point it killed a quarter of the world's population. You know, it was a constant fear. So I think, you know, perhaps there's an idea that political and economic and social instability gives rise to interesting art. Who knows? I mean, I do think art is our refutation to death, isn't it? It's our stake, it's our flag in the ground saying we're still here, we have survived.
Absolutely. I'm going to let you go in just a minute or two, but I was just wondering, obviously once a book is published, it goes out into the world, it becomes, you know, it's people have different kind of views about it. Was it hard to let this one go?
I think it's always a bit hard to let them go, actually, you know, because I think in a sense, when you finish a book, your involvement in it is over. You know, it's got to set sail in the world, and then it's in the lap of the gods what's going to happen to it. So it is and it isn't. I mean, you know, that's ultimately, you know, I think there's a strange dichotomy in the life of a writer, because, you know, you spend 2 years completely in your imagination at home, making up your own stories, talking to your imaginary friends, and then suddenly you're out in public, you know. Well, actually, most of them I'm not in public now. I'm at home, but in our new public. So it's a straight. They're very, very different, very different halves of one job.
And you're married to William Sutcliffe, himself a very successful novelist. Does it make kind of for interesting interactions when the two of you are going around in your different worlds?
I think our children will probably say quite boring interactions. My children, when I was writing Hamnet, my children limited me to only 1 chew de fact per day. I was only allowed 1 at the dinner table and no more.
Oh, that is excellent. I know, and you wrote your first children's book. Were your own family, were they good editors at home for you?
They are. Well, children are brilliant editors in the fact that they can give you very instant feedback. So if you're reading them a story, kids, if they're not interested, will just get up and walk away. So it's a very instant editorial notes. I'm
going to let you go now, but just a final question. You have a great fan base in France. How important is it just to see Hamnet now go into another beautiful Belfond edition? And unfortunately, we can't be celebrating with you in Paris, but a beautiful relationship you have with Belfond.
Oh, I am so lucky. I am so lucky to be with them, and it feels so special that I've been with them right from the start. And you know, I have a shelf in my house which is my Belfond shelf, and I have all my editions, and they're all so beautiful. So no, I'm just thrilled. I'm thrilled for our continuing relationship, and I can't wait to come back to Paris to see them all.
We can't wait to have you. You have to make sure you come to the Centre when you do. My last question, only because you gave a little clue away, your next work is also a historical novel, then.
It is, but I'm afraid, Derville, I can't say anything. But my other superstition, apart from my son catching the Black Death, is that I can't talk about things that I haven't finished, because I was worried that if I talk about them, then it's going to kind of drain me of the urge to write them. So that's all I can say, is that it's historical, I'm afraid. But I've nearly finished the first draft.
Oh, well, fantastic. And listen, we hope it has the great success that you've enjoyed with Hamnet. It has been wonderful to speak to you. I don't know if Nora is there. Nora, will I hand back to you? But from everyone, and thank you for staying on in such numbers. I am so sorry two Northern Ireland women went at each other with such ferocity and speed in our discussion, but I think it's just a reflection, Maggie, of the enthusiasm that people have for you and for your work. So thank you everyone for staying with us. I'm going to hand you back to Nora, and thank you so much, Maggie. We wish you all the best.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure. Lovely to see you, Devil.
Well, I mean, I'll just add a thank you to you both for such a wonderful conversation, a wonderful journey, and how it flowed. And I mean, such an incredible amount of information, but in a very entertaining and lively manner. I mean, it was most engaging. So I feel like I have, as an audience member, I can say that it was a wonderful hour spent with you both in your company. And thank you. And Maggie, we really do look forward to welcoming you back to the Centre Culturel very soon.
I'm counting the days. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks to you both. Bye. And to Camille. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.